4 years, I had been the devoted wife and mother. My marriage was never anything like the fairy tales. It wasn't filled with passionate declarations or grand romantic gestures. But it was steady, predictable, and I thought that was enough. My husband and I had settled into a comfortable routine, almost automatic in its daily rhythms. We lived together under one roof, raised our children with love, but over time, the spark between us faded. It wasn't something I actively noticed at first, because it happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. I figured it was just a natural part of aging, of growing old with someone. The distance between us became like a silent, invisible wall, and honestly, I didn't mind. I didn't even question it. I assumed this was simply how things were meant to be as time went on. But then, everything shifted. It was a typical weekend afternoon when things started to change. My son Ethan, who had just turned 21, had a group of friends over. Our house was always alive with their laughter and conversation, particularly on the weekends. The living room would be full of energy, the sound of clinking glasses, music playing, the guys joking and making plans. I was proud of Ethan, happy to see him so surrounded by good people, and that joy was something that kept the house feeling alive. Among his friends, one boy stood out, Ryan. He wasn't the loudest or the most attention-grabbing, but there was something about him that caught my eye. Ryan was a few years older than Ethan, 24 to be exact, and there was a quiet maturity about him that separated him from the rest. Tall, with messy blonde hair and an almost permanent easy smile, he had a warmth to him that seemed to light up a room. Ryan was always polite, respectful, and had this calming energy. He carried himself with a kind of presence that was hard to ignore. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a quiet Saturday, the kind of day that felt calm and unremarkable at first. Ethan and his friends were in the pool, enjoying the afternoon, while I stayed inside in the kitchen, preparing snacks for them. Suddenly, I noticed Ryan walking through the door, still dripping wet from the pool, his towel slung over his shoulder. He had a smile on his face that was bright enough to fill the entire room. "Mrs. Carter, do you need any help?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, his gaze warm. It was a simple question, yet the way he said it caught me off guard. I shook my head, smiling in return. "No thanks, Ryan. Go back to the pool and enjoy yourself," I told him. But he didn't move. He lingered there, leaning casually against the counter, his eyes fixed on me. There was something about his gaze, not intrusive, but deep, as though he saw me in a way no one had for a long time. It made me feel exposed, vulnerable, but in a way that was strangely comforting. "You always take such good care of everyone," he said softly, his tone sincere. "You deserve a moment to rest too." I was taken aback by his words. No one had said anything like that to me in years. I didn't know how to respond at first. I tried to deflect, keeping my tone light. "That's just what mothers do, isn't it?" I said, trying to brush off the moment. But the way he looked at me, it was as though his words held more meaning than I had anticipated. It wasn't just the content of his statement, but the way he said it, the gentleness in his voice, and the way he held my gaze. It all made the air between us feel different. There was an energy in that simple interaction that I couldn't ignore, though I tried to dismiss it. As the weeks went on, I began noticing Ryan more and more. It wasn't something I planned. It wasn't an attraction I had consciously pursued, but there was no denying how his presence seemed to capture my attention. Whenever he was around, it felt as though he had this magnetic pull. His smile could light up any room, and his manner was so naturally warm that I couldn't help but be drawn to him. He started to find reasons to linger around me, usually in the kitchen where I often found myself, preparing food or cleaning. He would make little excuses to chat, sometimes just asking if I needed help with something. It seemed harmless at first, just friendly gestures. But I couldn't help but feel that there was more to it, something I couldn't easily explain. It wasn't like he was overtly flirtatious or making bold advances. It was subtle, the way his eyes lingered on me a little too long, the warmth in his voice when he spoke, the way he seemed to listen to me in a way that no one else had for years. But everything truly changed on one quiet night. Ethan had gone out with his friends, leaving Ryan behind. He mentioned that he wasn't feeling well, so I offered to make him some tea. We ended up sitting together in the living room, and for the first time in a long while, the silence in the house felt different, almost remarkable. Without the usual noise of Ethan's friends and the hustle and bustle of daily life, the stillness between us felt intimate, almost tangible. We talked for hours. I found myself opening up to Ryan in ways I hadn't planned. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice, but just listened, really listened, to what I had to say. His eyes stayed locked on mine, not with intensity, but with a depth of understanding that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I found myself sharing things I hadn't even realized I needed to express, the difficulties of my everyday life, the fears I rarely spoke of, and how loneliness had begun to creep into my life. "You are amazing, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You deserve to feel special." His words resonated within me, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. It was as if he had peeled back the layers I had spent years building around myself. In that moment, I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet for the first time in so long, I didn't feel invisible. And then, without warning, the air between us shifted. The silence became charged, and before I had time to think, Ryan leaned in and kissed me. I froze, my mind screaming that this was wrong, that I should stop him, but my body felt like it was responding to something long forgotten. The kiss was gentle at first, but there was an intensity to it that caught me off guard. It ignited a spark within me, something I hadn't felt in years. But just as suddenly, the sound of the front door opening, a familiar noise that signaled the return of normalcy, snapped me out of the moment. Reality rushed back in, and I pulled away, heart pounding in my chest. Jolt. Ethan's voice echoed through the house, sharp and urgent. The sound struck me like a thunderclap, sending a rush of panic through my body. My breath hitched. My limbs tensed. I barely had time to process what had just happened before Ryan took a quick step back, his movements abrupt as if physically withdrawing from the moment itself. His face betrayed nothing. Pretending as though nothing had occurred, he composed himself effortlessly. But I knew better. I knew that he, like me, was grappling with the weight of what had transpired. I, on the other hand, stood frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears, my body refusing to move, my mind racing to untangle the mess of emotions that had erupted within me. Guilt, confusion, fear, a volatile mix that clung to me for the rest of the night, suffocating and relentless. Sleep was impossible. I lay next to my husband, Steve, who breathed steadily in deep slumber, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. My thoughts circled the same moment over and over, like a needle stuck on a broken record. How did it happen? How did I let it happen? I searched for answers but found none, only the overwhelming reality of my own actions. And beneath the weight of guilt, something else stirred, something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to admit. By morning, I resolved to avoid Ryan at all costs. I assumed he felt the same, that he too would need distance to let the situation dissipate into silence. With Ethan preoccupied with his commitments for the day, I felt safe in my solitude, certain that I could get through the day without facing him. But then the doorbell rang. My heart leapt into my throat. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before walking to the door. When I opened it, my breath caught. There stood Ryan, holding a small toolbox, his expression casual yet betraying a nervous energy beneath the surface. "Ethan said you needed help with the closet in the laundry room," he said lightly, forcing a small smile. His tone was easy, nonchalant. But his eyes told another story. A silent war waged within me. I knew I should decline. Knew I should tell him that I had it handled. But my lips refused to form the words. A moment of silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken thoughts, heavier than any conversation could have been. Finally, I nodded and stepped aside, inviting him in. Ryan entered, his movements measured, the weight of our unspoken tension palpable between us. As I led him to the laundry room, I noticed how different everything felt, as if the very air around us had changed, infused with something unspeakable yet undeniable. "It's just this hinge here," I said, pointing to the cabinet. My voice was steady, practical. At least, that was what I wanted it to be. Instead, it came out with the slightest tremor, a weakness I prayed he wouldn't notice. Ryan knelt down, his hands deftly working through the tools in his box, his actions precise and practiced. The metallic clink of tools echoed in the small space, filling the void of silence that stretched between us. "Have you been doing this long?" I asked, desperate to break the tension, to steer the conversation toward anything safer. "My father was a carpenter," he answered without looking up, his focus on the hinge. "I learned from him. It was kind of our way of spending time together." His words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to share something so personal, and for a moment, the heavy air between us lifted. A glimpse into his past, into something real and tangible, momentarily eased the tension. Encouraged by the shift, I asked more. He spoke about his childhood, his stories carrying a warmth that contrasted with the tension that usually surrounded him. The nostalgia in his voice softened the lines of his face, making him seem more grounded, more real. Our conversation began to flow more naturally. And yet, beneath it all, there remained an undercurrent, a charged silence that neither of us dared to address. Ryan finished his work quickly, standing up and testing the cabinet with a light tap. "There," he said, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of his lips. "That should last a few more years now." I smiled back, forcing normalcy into the moment, but inside, my mind was still whirling. What did this mean? What were we pretending hadn't happened? As he packed up his tools, I noticed the way his movement slowed, the way he hesitated. He wanted to say something. I could feel it in the charged air between us. But he didn't. "Well," Ryan finally said, exhaling as he stood, "I think I'm done here." He looked at me then, just for a second, but in that second, something unspoken passed between us. Something heavy, something raw. Something that neither of us had the courage to name. As he turned and walked toward the door, I stood there, watching his retreating figure, feeling the space between us stretch and settle into silence. The door closed with a soft click, and suddenly, the house felt hollow. As if something had come and gone, like the tail end of a storm leaving behind an unsettling calm. I stood there, alone, surrounded by my own thoughts. Why had that interaction felt so weighted? And what would come next?